It works. Yep. So hi, my name is Quentin, and today I'm going to be presenting my talk on how to make hydrogen fuel cells cheaper and more efficient. So my initial title was Performance and Efficiency of Non-Proton Catalysts for Fuel Cells, but I was advised that it was actually nice to have a title that people can actually understand. So here it goes. So I work in Professor Zhao's group in the nanochemistry lab. We basically work across several aspects, from water electrolyzers, hydrogen storage, hydrogen fuel cell, which is my main area of research. And then we have areas of expertise, material discovery, characterization tools, and commercializations. So about me, my name is Quentin. I graduated from a PhD with award for research excellence from UCL in 2016, working on advanced diagnostics of fuel cells. After that, I did a postdoc when I worked on basically neutron imaging and X-ray CT of fuel cells. Then I moved to Australia in 2017 when I worked for about a year as a consultant working on batteries and fuel cells for startups. After that, I joined Professor Zhao's group as a senior postdoc and cluster leader, where I helped set up the hydrogen lab in the first year. And then after that, I've been leading the fuel cell research from catalysis to systems, working from all the way from analysis all the way to real devices and stacks. And I received in 2021 the Young Chemist Award. At the moment, I've got about 50 papers published and I've H-index of 25. So this is the world we live in. As everyone knows, we've got fossil fuel on one side. Then you guys have heard a lot about the hydrogen society, which uses hydrogen for more sustainable energy, using basically all sorts of energies. And the main type that we're working on today is hydrogen fuel cells, which use hydrogen and oxygen to generate water and electricity. So low temperature fuel cells. So how does that look like? You basically have a Nafion membrane in the middle. You have catalyst on both sides of the anode and cathode reactions. And basically you have both reactions happening, electrons go across, and what happens is you have hydrogen turning into protons and electrons, and oxygen reacting with proton electrons and forming water, and this whole reaction generates electricity in the process. So I've got quite a few drawings in the presentation, because for me it's actually important to make, if you can't visualize what you're making, you need to actually try to simplify it until you can actually see it. So this is a fuel cell structure, how it looks like. You basically have a catalyst layer in blue, catalyst layer in black, a gas-fuel layer in blue, you have a membrane in red, catalyst layer on the other side, and this all together makes a fuel cell structure. So how do you actually start to make it? First step is you start with some carbon fiber papers. So that's basically cellulose material that are pyrolyzed typically. Then from there, you coat them with PTFE for hydrophobicity. On top of that, you add a microporous layer or MPL, which is carbon nanoparticles mixed with PTFE. That gives you a GDL typically that you use for all sorts of application. On top of that, you typically coat your catalyst on the GDL or on the membrane. Then you centrifuge the whole thing together. You make the same on the other side, and that gives you your membrane to assembly, which is the building blocks for fuel cell. So now looking at fuel cells, they've been out there for over 20 years, but they're still not really reaching large-scale commercialization. So main reason why is it's pretty obvious, they're still not quite affordable enough. So when you look at this graph on the left-hand side, this is actually an estimate of the cost of fuel cell. It's not even real. You may have seen a lot of people showing you this. This is assuming that the supply chain for all the things on the top has been optimized, and then you still look at material price, and you have platinum, which accounts for 50 to 60% of the cost of a fuel cell. So this is quite a big problem for us, because how can we commercialize something that's never going to be affordable? Best way to do it is actually to look at cheaper materials. What we've got is other metals such as iron. If you look at the price of platinum, you're about $100,000 per kilogram. Look at the price of iron ore, you're $0.2 per kilogram, so a million times cheaper. The good thing for chemists and chemical engineers, iron-based material have an affinity for the oxygen reduction, so they are a good alternative to platinum. But when you move from one material to another one, another type of catalyst, you have some extremely unique challenges. So this is when basically you need to start doing some advanced characterization. That's why I've got the magnifying glass back with Poirot. So basically hydrogen fuel cells use scarce and costly platinum-based catalysts. These materials, these alternative platinum, such as iron-based catalysts, they have a good stability in liquid cells, but they face low performance and stability in real devices. So why that happens, best way to find out is to go in depth and do in situ product characterization to understand the real devices. So we've developed our own hydrogen carbon catalyst. So synthesis is confidential, but overall, what we're fairly confident is that we have a single atom hydrogen carbon catalyst with ionization X moieties. So now looking at catalyst for the oxygen reduction reaction, you basically have first step is the rotating disk electrode, or RDE. When you're basically in liquid cell electrolyte, it's a very much optimized system. You have an infinite proton source because you're saturating acidic electrolyte. You've got your electrons coming from your disk electrodes. You've got an infinite amount of diluted oxygen. So it's quite a good system to work with. Then you move to a real device. In a real device, you typically have an ionomer, which is naphthalene that is binding materials to your ink together. Then you coat it on a membrane, not on an electrode, and you start having all sorts of problems. To replace this image, the type of things that become quite a challenge can be proton transport, gas diffusion. You want to produce water, but if you produce way too much water, you have flooding. Flooding is not a good thing. It's going to block gas diffusion. It's also going to, if you don't have enough water, you're going to have other problems, loss of ionic conductivity, and you end up with all sorts of problems. And what you end up with is that in a fuel cell, basically the OR only happens at the electrode, electrolyte, and gas interface, or triple phase boundary. Now, looking at performance of our catalyst in RDE. So in RDE, it's quite a good system. You've got your reference, you're taking disk electrode, counter electrode. We get some pretty decent performance, half-wave potential of 0.81 volt for iron, 0.84 for platinum. So this is a good start. That's typically when you go, okay, I'm quite happy with that. I can start going into a real device. So looking at the electrode structure in a real device, you basically have two very different electrode structures. So on the left side, I'm going to try the pointer. I'm colorblind, so I actually don't know where the pointer is. So I just have to hopefully find it somehow. Yes, there you are. So this is the platinum electrode. So it's a very well optimized structure. By optimized, that means that for 20 years, people have tinkered with the ink, the particle size, to get it to the point that it works the best. What you get is a very thin electrode, 0.1 to 0.4 milligrams per meter square. From kind of thickness, you get 5 to 15 microns. You've got some very nicely distributed platinum particles on small carbon nanoparticles, and you've got a very nice interaction between your ionomer and your particles. That's pretty good. Now you look at PGM-free catalyst, much more recent material. The ink is not optimized yet, and there is still a huge amount of work to do in this area. Kind of problems you have, let me play this one, is if you look at non-functional catalyst, you firstly have, often the synthesis is done through pyrolysis. Pyrolysis is going to right away create large particle agglomerates that are going to stick together no matter how well you try to separate them afterwards. Another issue you've got is the materials are not quite as active as platinum. Because they're not quite as active, you need a higher amount, higher loading. What you typically have is loadings between 100 and 180 micron thick, 1 to 6 milligrams per meter square. So 100 micron, that's the thickness of a human hair. So it's something you can actually see with your own eyes because it's so thick. When something is that thick, things that you may take for granted, like proton transport to your active sites, like the arrows I'm showing again, this may actually take quite a while. Same for gas diffusion, electron transport may be a problem because your electron needs to travel all the way to a specific active site you've made. That is not necessarily easy. And so what I really want to try to do is actually try to understand these challenges and not just get, okay, we understand them, but actually quantify them and visualize them. So this is the performance we get of our catalyst in fuel cell. This is actually in red is a fairly decent PGM-free catalyst. We get about 1.1 watts per meter square, which places us in the top range of materials. When we compare it with platinum, we still have quite a way to go. Platinum gives you about 1.8 watts per meter square. If you even look at fully commercial fuel cells, you typically get somewhere around 2.4, 2.5 watts per meter square. So we still have a large way to go for material. The things we do know, however, is that because we apply a lot of back pressure, we have limited gas diffusion problems, and we mostly have charge transfer problems. So transfer of charge to the active sites. And so how do we actually characterize them? Best way, as I was saying, is doing some in situ and inoperator measurements and trying to focus as much as possible on the device level challenges. So the kind of techniques that I use a lot, and I actually gave some sample to Shen. Yeah, sure, take your time. Yeah. So the technique I use a lot is called X-ray computed tomography. So X-ray computed tomography is basically like doing an MRI of your body, but instead of an MRI, you actually put a small sample in an X-ray machine, and then you basically rotate it on a 360-degree angle, and you get and then you do some bit of processing, and you get a 3D image of your sample. So for all types of material, such as gas diffusion layers, it works really well. You get a very nice image with a good resolution of carbon fibers, microporous layer, and all sorts of material. And from there, what you can do is actually try to look at how they look like and how the materials evolve and degrade over time. So this was done, I think, on a CT machine in UCL years ago, but we have the same machine in USW, and the work I'll be presenting moving forward was obtained in USW on the CT machine in the Tyree building. So as I was saying, this comes straight down from in here in the Tyree building. What we've got, this is an iron nitrogen carbon electrode, where basically you have a gas diffusion layer, a membrane, and then I've segmented only half the cell. So the cathode catalyst layer is between 100 and 180 microns thick. So that's the material that in red over here. That's very thick. All sorts of interesting problems because of its thickness. It's actually very hard to diffuse gases through. The way it dries also gives you some interesting problems. You can see here we've got some weird cracks in the electrode thickness. This is typically not what you want to have, because that means that as the material dried, it basically solidified and cracked. And then when you deposit the next layer, the materials won't actually stick well onto each other. This will create flooding, will create low contact, will basically make a lot of your catalyst electroinactive. Same time, you look at platinum, it's quite the opposite. It's a very thin, very uniform material. You have cracks through the material, which are excellent for gas diffusion. Completely opposite of this kind of cracks you've got in the catalyst layer. Other interesting thing you can even see is you can actually see it on the big sample in yellow that Shen is passing around. You actually have a very rough membrane structure, and that membrane becomes so rough because you're pressing a very sharp material on a very smooth material. And if you think of commercial based membranes, which are about 5 to 10 microns, you could actually create a pinhole in your membrane by just pressing a catalyst that's not smooth. So these things give you all sorts of problems. They may even lower your performance right away, lower your voltage, and they cause you all sorts of problems. But now, another technique that I work a lot with is called impedance spectroscopy, using distribution of relaxation times. What EIS can do for you is basically you impose a small perturbation of current, and you record a small voltage response. You do this at one frequency, you get a phase shift magnitude signal, and you go, okay, now I'm going to try the next frequency. You keep on doing this, and you get what's called a Nyquist plot. So Nyquist plots, the problem that many people have, and I've faced it many times, it's a bit like a black box. You get a cute semicircle, and you don't really know what to do from there. You often get stuck. So you can do some modeling, find some equivalent circuit. You can do a physical-based model. But the problem of these techniques is equivalent circuits, 1,000 of them can actually fit to your system, and you actually end up quite struggling to analyze it. Physical-based models, it's even worse because you need to go into maybe 50 equations to fit your Nyquist plot. So that can be quite challenging to do. So instead, a technique that has emerged over the last 5 years is called the distribution of relaxation times. It's basically taking your EIS over here, putting it through the equation, and turning it into this graph. So this graph is actually a lot easier to look at. So this is not a model, it's just purely mathematical equation, taking this, turning it into that one. It's a lot easier to understand for us, for chemistry, chemical engineering. For some people, it looks a bit more like XPS spectrum. You've got different peaks correspond to different process, and you basically have a range of materials, and it's a model-free approach. So for fuel cells, the way it works is there's been a lot of groups who spend a long time doing some very nice peak identification. But overall, the best way to identify the peaks in your process is thinking of what is a slow process I'm looking at. In our case, we know gas diffusion is very slow, so it's going to be at very low frequency. Proton transport and electrolyte resistance in the membrane are a very fast process. That's very likely happening here. And then my reaction I'm looking at, in this case, the OR, would be the middle peak. And this has been very well studied on fuel cells. So that's why we're quite confident on how the peak allocation works. So now we took our catalyst and we scanned them with impedance spectroscopy, and we get this kind of weird, pretty 3D graphs. The way they look for is here you've got very high charge transfer resistance, then you have an ohmic region, and then some sort of mass transport limitations, but very minimal, happening at low frequencies. So when you look at platinum and PGM3, the catalyst the impedance results are actually looking fairly similar to each other. What you've got in between the two is overall same kind, charge transfer, mass transport, and ohmic. But one thing you can see right away, if you look at the frequency of the peak, it's about 40 Hertz in one case and about 5 Hertz in the other case. What that can tell you right away is that something is much slower in one case than the other one. And that's because you basically have a lower frequency that below semicircle, which indicates there are a lot more stuff happening here. Unlike here, when this kind of frequency is basically all over this region. So it doesn't really tell you what's going on, just that you're looking at something that's slower in one case than the other case. Yep, there you go. So instead, what I've done is I used my DRT, my very fancy DRT new technique, and then I did a little bit of MATLAB to basically measure the points, the black lines, and interpolate what's happening between the lines to get an idea of a continuous process. And so first thing we see on our platinum catalyst is you get proton transport limitations at very low current densities that eventually can't be detected anymore. You've got an OR peak at about, I think, somewhere around 50 Hertz that slowly merges with proton transport limitations at high current densities and some gas diffusion problems. Now, when you look at our PGM3 catalyst, we overall have the same kind of shapes, but quite different processes going on. So proton transport is much wider and much lower frequencies. OR happens much slower, probably about 5 to 10 times slower. And finally, gas diffusion is looking overall similar, but still looks shifted towards lower frequency. So the reason this happens are multiple reasons. First one is proton transport will be far more challenging because you have a very thick electrode. Also, your protons have to go all the way within nanopores, whereas for platinum on carbon, the platinum is only on the surface of carbon nanoparticles. So there isn't this degree. Similarly, for the OR reaction, you've got this whole problem over here as well of much slower reaction for the same reasons. And gas diffusion will also be slowed down simply because of the structure and thickness of the electrode. So this approach is actually good to assess performance of single atom catalysts. And this extends to even other types of catalysts and works well in any type of electronic devices. You don't need to have a very fancy model. You just capture your process, and you should be able to capture. You should always obtain similar things regardless of the material, but the way the peaks are distributed and the frequency they are is directly caused by your material properties, basically. So now that's the first step. So we know our material is much slower. Now we want to know our material stable. So I spent far too much time finding a cute image on the top, but basically what happens with PGM3 catalyst is it's like jumping off a cliff. You initially jump, it's quite good, then you fall very quickly. So these materials lose about between 30 and 80% of the performance after 100 hours in aggressive conditions. Aggressive condition is literally applying a high current density, which would be what you do in a device. So what's quite interesting and scary at the same time is some of the best catalysts are the least stable. And as a result, you may make an amazing catalyst with a very fancy structure with decorating single atom catalyst. If they lose performance in 20 hours, then they're not going to make it. They will just remain a scientific curiosity when you may mention in the last figure a supplementary stability will be fixed. So what we wanted to do is understand why do we have such stability problems in fuel cells. So again, as I was saying, on this graph over there, you can see the performance and stability, basically performance loss over time. So I spent far too much time during lockdown making this figure. But what you can see here, these are the record-breaking catalysts. And basically in 35 hours, there is only 20% of the performance left. And this happens for all sorts of catalysts in literature, and they all lose stability extremely quickly. This one lost 50% in less than 8 hours. So that's even scarier. And the problem when you have such stability problems is how do you actually look at reporting performance? So say you report the peak power density once. So you publish that right away. What people don't often tell you is what happened when they measured it a second time right away afterwards. That's what you get. You measure it a third time, that's what you get. You get the story. You basically have a problem when it's very unreliable to actually capture performance, very difficult. You capture something as fast as you can, you publish it, you go to Nature Energy, they're completely okay with it. And then you just mention at the end that you still haven't quite fixed that. So it's quite difficult to analyze it in fuel cells, mostly because you have processes when you lose 20% of performance in 5 to 10 hours. So it's difficult to select a method to characterize it properly. So there is still a good understanding of what's happening, even we're not sure quite how it happens. There are two main mechanisms that can kill your energy catalyst. First one is simply ion demethylation. So your iron nitrogen carbon iron active substance is not quite stable. It's going to leach out of your structure. That's the first problem you've got. Second one is you're using amorphous carbon, which is going to corrode as you operate your cell at 80 degrees and at high current densities. As it corrodes, you may end up also losing your iron site because you lost so much carbon, you're just going to, at some point, lose your catalyst as well. So it's okay, you understand what's happening, but you don't actually know how it's taking place in a real device. So this is the stability of our performance of our catalyst in red. This, as I was saying, is actually a very respectable stability as far as you're concerned for PGM-free catalyst. It probably positions it in the top stability figure I was showing up before, but basically in 60 hours you've lost half your performance. So what we've done is we've done some physical measurements at different steps. We also designed an experiment when we captured basically polarization curves, impedance, and CVs at different stages to try to understand what's happening. And basically, when we take a measurement, it's like we're freezing the state of the cell. We take a quick polarization curve, quick impedance, then we carry on the stability. We're pretty confident that it's not impacting things too much because it's overall looking very similar to a continuous degradation. So before we did all that, we actually tried to do some operandum measurements. So the kind of things we've done was first X-ray CT. We tried to do CT of the same cell. So we sent the samples to Canada, but the problem we had with stability issue was so big that they couldn't operate the samples in an operandum cell. Because by the time it made to Canada, sample was basically already dead. So what we did instead was we made one sample, scanned it, then we made a new MEA and we scanned it again, but they look overall very similar in terms of main features of sort of cracks, but the kind of very clear difference. This is about 100 microns thick. This is about 10 to 20 microns thick. So you lose about 80% of thickness. Also, what's interesting is the electrode surface is much smoother, and that's typically signatures of carbon corrosion. When your electrode collapses on itself, agglomerates, and basically just becomes a much smoother material, much thinner, because you corrode your carbon. Now, we did also some Xanth measurement. So we took our entire MEA and we just ran different MEAs that had operated for different times. We ran them, sealed them, then went to the beamline the next day and tried to characterize them. But what we can clearly see is we're confident we've got single atom catalyst. So that's a good step. Now looking at our iron edge, you can see shifting towards higher and higher oxidation states. We coupled that with more techniques such as TEM and ICP. TEM shows that we have some small iron oxide nanoparticles on a catalyst surface. ICP shows that we are losing a large amount of our iron. So what we can derive from this is basically you have two mechanisms. First one is iron is leaching of the surface of the material. At the same time, what happens is you have your demethylation, so it forms ions, and then the deposits as iron oxides. And that's actually why you see an increase in oxidation states. It's not from the catalyst, from your active site, it's coming from the products that form on the catalyst surface. So these measurements are good, they're physical measurements. It doesn't tell you how it's impacting your performance. It just tells you your physical state structure is changing. Now going further into current measurements. So we capture the polarization curve literally 16 times. Every time we stop, we capture the polarization curve. We can see very quickly the first 10 hours, you lose about half the power, the performance, and then in the next 50 hours, about the other half. So one thing we can look at from the polarization curve is the active site loss, which is basically, according to a few good papers published recently, it's nearly proportional to the activation current density at 0.8 volt after our correction. So that's what we did, plotted a line 0.8 volt, corrected with the ohmic resistance, and this is what we get, which is the active site retention. Initially, you have 100% electrochemically active sites, and then within about 10 hours, you lose 75% of your active sites. That's quite bad. That's not what you want to see. losing that much active site so quickly. The interesting thing, however, is that in this region, which is about the next 50 hours, you don't really seem to lose active sites, but you still lose about 50% of your performance. So what kind of thing is going on here? So what's very likely to happen is carbon corrosion. So to capture carbon corrosion, we did some cyclic voltammetry. When we saturated the cathode side with nitrogen, we kept the anode with hydrogen as a reference electrode. And this is what we obtained. So we obtained these kind of peaks. And here that this peak corresponds to the iron oxide, iron redox peak. Here corresponds to quinone and hydroquinone products, which are basically carbon-based species that are forming during carbon corrosion. So that they've been well identified literature linked with carbon products. And so what we've done is first you can actually see that the iron peak is very big at the beginning, then it gets very small very quickly. This peak increases eventually. Initially, not a lot of increase, then increases a lot. And what we've done, we've tried to do a bit of fitting here of these two peaks to get the peak area, which gives you a sense of the charges allocated to both processes. And what we've got from here is we're losing our iron very quickly. Looks similar to this one, just not quite as clean to capture it. And then our carbon, basically, we get a first increase in the first maybe 10 hours. And then in the next 50 hours, you got a linear increase. So what's likely to happen is in the first 10 hours, you have a hydrogen peroxide happening, which leads to a very fast carbon corrosion. And then it's just natural corrosion of amorphous carbon products in the electrode. So now this was all pretty good, but the problem you've got when you capture polarization curves, or even when you do CVs, is your device is not at the current of when you're degrading it at. So what we went to was doing impedance measurement at 1 amp per meter square, and that corresponds exactly to the state of the cell as the voltage is dropping. So initially, you have basically a bit of charge transfer, proton transport, and then a little bit of mass transport here. And then you can see the Nyquist gets really, really big. There seems to be a lot more processes at low frequency. Here, 10 Hertz was just this region with not much going on. Here, it's over half of the semicircle, which shows you've got a big problem going on. Something is becoming much lower. So we looked at DRT analysis, and we get a much clearer picture. Initially, you just have proton transport as one peak. And then as the cell degrades, it splits into two peaks, one proton transport in the membrane, and one is proton transport in the ionomer of the catalyst layer. What this indicates is proton transport become much more difficult in the catalyst layer. There are two likely reasons. The first one is you have iron demetallation. So your iron ions are going to contaminate your ionomer, reduce proton conductivity. The other problem you have is you have to remember the electrode is collapsing on itself. And so you initially had some very nice proton pathways through naphion. Now your naphion may be just not touching any catalyst anymore. A lot of it is not interacting with anything. And as a result, you basically have areas when it's extremely difficult to reach an active site. Now, one problem you've got is the OR has become much lower. So this is initially the overall OR rate in catalyst layer. It shifts to low frequencies. It also has a much higher resistance. Kind of reasons for this is first that you may have two types of active sites. So there is a trend in literature emerging that there is two types of active sites that you form as you easily form when you make an electrochemical catalyst. One type is very active but highly thermodynamically unstable. So they would be the first ones with the trend of the trend of the first active sites here. And then as you degrade the electrode, you end up with a much lower, with the second type of active site that are much lower but thermodynamically stable. The other possible approach is that you are still dealing with the same active site, but one is in the surface of the electrode, so very easy to reach. The other one, you've lost the actual surface, and you're only looking at what's inside the volume of your electrode, going very deeper and deeper and deeper into nanopores. And that would also reduce your RR. What's a bit interesting, and we're still looking into it, is you can see that the mass transport peak initially is quite large, and then becomes smaller and smaller, and eventually just completely gone. So one likely reason is that your catalyst layer is collapsing, but because it was so thick initially, it becomes thinner. You just have easier gas diffusion overall through it. Even if you still have a lot of problems, overall you don't have that one problem you don't have anymore. That's probably a bad thing because it happens because the carbon has completely corroded. So this gives you quite a good overview of what's happening. So overall, we've got this kind of mechanism happening at the moment. First step, this is your catalyst layer structure. So you have a lot of, I've got a schematic, you've got a lot, you can imagine a lot of little ion-edged index active sites. You've got some naphthalene ionomer that's creating proton pathway. And the first step, degradation, is you have basically iron demethylation and oxide formations. So you have more and more oxidal particles covering the surface. You've lost a lot of active site. Your ionomer still looks overall the same. Now, the next step, which is basically when you lose most of performance, what happens is you can see that your carbon, there you go. Yep. Your carbon has become a lot more porous, so you have large hole. You can imagine this sort of large hole in your structure. You've lost even more active site. Your ionomer also looks thinner, and I made it look like there isn't much contact anymore because you can't conduct, you're creating more heat, have less water, and your ionomer stops functioning as well. So overall, you have this two-step process. First step, you lose active sites. And the second step is you basically reduce the catalyst layer at utilization. Your active sites are still present, but it becomes harder and harder to reach them. That's because your catalyst layer is collapsing, because you can't conduct protons. And as a result, your performance will get worse, even though the material, the catalyst you've made is actually still present. And what I find very difficult for this is that we could only obtain this knowledge of what's happening through operando characterization. If you make a material and you just stop at the level of just capturing this and quoting the same conclusion that other people, you may not understand what's happening in your own material. And that applies to other fields, not just to fuel cell, obviously. It's important to go what you can call going under the hood, doing operando measurements to find out what's happening in my material. So now I've talked a lot about catalysts. Now I'm going to talk about something else altogether. So now, basically, how to look at water and gas diffusion on large scale. So fuel cells operate below 100 degrees. As a result, they form a lot of water. And this water is a good thing, could conduct protons, but it's a bad thing at the same time because it will cause dehydration and flooding. You don't want flooding. If you have flooding, you can't reach your active sites. You're done. So in PGM-free catalyst, because we have such a thick electrode, flooding is even more of a problem because you can have catalyst layer flooding in itself, just cracks in the catalyst layer, and just a lot of water forming inside these cracks. So before we actually looked at PGM-free catalyst, we wanted to have a good large-scale model of the water transport in a fuel cell. So an easy problem everyone has faced all the time is if you want to scan something with any technique, say SCM, TEM, any technique, if you want to look at a large area, you will never get a high resolution. That's just the chicken and egg problem. The larger you get, the lower your pixels, the lower resolution. The more you zoom in, the higher resolution. So how do you actually try to go around this? Capture a large area. So this is a sample, probably about 1 square, and capture large resolution. So in terms of hardware, it's simply not possible. So what people do when they want to model fuel cells is they either capture a very small part of this, say probably 200 or 300 microns area, which are the kind of size I was showing before, and then make a very complex Lightning-Boltzmann simulation on a very small area. Or you go a different way. You just forget about the real model, the real physical structure, and you make assumptions of what's physics in your model, and you just go, you forget what's happening, and you just go with purely physical equations and assumptions. So these two approaches are very valid. The problem with them is that when you make just assumptions, you may forget the physical challenges. When you use a much smaller area, you don't actually know if this small area, if you looked at, was actually presenting the entire sample. So what we've done instead with our collaborators from Tyree Building in petroleum engineering in the School of Mineral and Energy Resources, I think I'm saying the name correctly, is basically developed a new approach called super resolution imaging, which basically gives you, I'm trying to post this. So on the top side, we've got basically a CT image of a fuel cell, and what looks like it's moving, oh, go back, that happens all the time, is we're actually moving through the thickness of the fuel cell. And what happens basically is you've got your carbon fibers here, microporous layer, in bright white, you've got a catalyst, you've got your membrane here, and the other side is symmetrical. The problem you've got, the 4 micron resolution, is your carbon fibers are about 5 microns. So with 4 micron resolution, you actually can't really see a single fiber. You've got more like big lumps of clumped fibers together. You can't see much of that. So what we propose to do is called super resolution imaging. which has emerged for characterization of rock-based sample, is you take a small area of this sample, you scan it with a higher resolution, and then you use machine learning to improve the resolution of the entire sample. And that gave us this image. Bottom image gives you a much clearer picture, kind of things you can really see. Here, you can see every single carbon fiber in the surface. You can see really well the microporous layer interacting with fibers. You can see a very clean interface between the ionomer and the catalyst layer. And you get overall a much clearer picture of what you're looking at. So now, this is something I've done with collaborators, but basically, now that you have a good image, you can actually segment it. Segmenting it means taking your image and assigning what its materials are. So don't focus too much on this part unless you do machine learning. If you do machine learning imaging, this characterization, everyone uses a weird drawing like this. But basically what it tells you is you segment a small area, use machine learning to segment the entire volume. And this is what you get. So on top, that's our low resolution image. In the middle, that's our super resolution image. And then on this side is the machine learning segmentation. And that's how it looks like. So something hard to see on one side, that's the raw image. Then that's our CT, and the segmentation means we've assigned every single material. Machine learning has assigned this to microporous layer. In red, you've got the carbon fibers, you've got a membrane in the middle, and the same on the other side. So what do you do when you have such a nice 3D segmentation of your material? What kind of things we did? We fed this with Boltzmann simulation to try to simulate how water is actually evolving in this structure. So what happens is every pixel or every voxel, we assume there is a set amount of water emerging, and then we apply a flow of gas. And that shows you basically what happens in fuel cell. So this is the kind of size, 200, I think we have 200 micron scale here for the channels. So 1 millimeter here. This is the kind of scale you could see if you had a see-through fuel cell. You initially have water droplets creating, so they move very quickly. Then you have dead-ended operations. Dead-end is the case when you close the exhaust to save fuel. So that happens a lot for fuel cell to save hydrogen. You just don't want it flowing forever. So as you close the exhaust, you have right away flooding happenings. And then you establish the free flow mode, you can see things flowing. So this was done using some of the world's most powerful computers. So I learned that when computers have a name, that means something instead of power. I had no idea before. So Submit is the 5th most powerful computer in the world. And we also use GADI for simulation, which is the most powerful computer in Australia. Initially, these things were done, I believe, used to simulate explosions in very high reactors, but they can also be used for renewable energy, simulating processes in fuel cell. So in terms of us as chemists and you guys for chemical engineer, you can think of what can I learn from this image. So the very clear feature from this image is that you have very clear water accumulation in this sort of areas. And then as you go dead-ended, you have like water flooding everywhere. So what can you do to fix it? The kind of thing you can think of is I could change my gas phase layer properties, making holes into it or making it more hydrophobic, depending on what you want to cause. You can actually also change your flow field designs and trying to think of if I was to make a different, this is not a real flow field. We just overlaid a flow field on our model. Is if you change the flow field, how is it going to impact my model? And then from there, could I actually make it for real, the CNC, and see how it impacts performance? So this is the kind of things you can do from this model. And this is where we are researching that at the moment. So now to conclude the talk, I hope no one fell asleep too much during the talk. So overall, on the left side, I've got basically a figure that a friend of mine did, which is using some very impressive graphic design. I just held a football ball in my hands and then he created this. But the idea of it is that on this side, you've got some characterization techniques. So you could imagine here SEM, TEM, XCT, even AFM and all sorts of techniques. And the problem you've got with these techniques is that you always make the assumption that the area you're looking at represents the entire sample. The problem is it never represents the entire sample. That's extremely unlikely to happen unless you're extremely lucky. And in practice, what you've got is if you look at things like current temperature mapping or other types of gradients, you have a very large distribution of current across the fuel cell. This applies to any device you use. Electrolyzers, same problem. CR flow cells, you assume it's uniform distribution. It isn't. So my overall aim one day is to be able to know exactly what area I'm imaging. I've seen some recent work when they target areas in particular, which is the way you should do, is if you think that you may have more problems towards the cell inlet, you should specifically probe samples from the inlet. So now, taking a step back, what have we learned about fuel cell? So we haven't quite gotten there in terms of our characterization, but we know what we want to look for. So our catalysts, they have some structural problems and some electrochemical problems. And the two problems are even completely linked with each other. So we've done some operando methods. What they've given us is we have a better understanding of their behavior and stability. We know that active sites are lost very quickly, but it's not the end of the story. After you lose your active site, you actually have a decay in your catalyst utilization. It means all the active site remaining becomes harder and harder to conduct the reaction that you're looking for. And the kind of mitigation strategies. So there's more things that are going on in the field, and we are looking at some of them, but the first type is making a brand new catalyst with a much higher active site accessibility. So that's things that are going on in some commercial companies, making much larger pores, and hopefully you don't have nanopore problems, or you change the electrode structure completely, trying to make it with basically highways for proton conductivity, areas when you can conduct a lot more gas, and areas when you can conduct a lot more water out of the cell. So this is area to look for, improved gas diffusion. Some interesting areas, what I've seen is making some more resistant ionomer and some more resistant carbon support. So what this means is you completely accept that you're going to have iron demethylation, but what if you could make sure that your ionomer is not going to be affected as much because you don't have iron contamination of your ionomer? So that's an area that's being looked at. Other areas I've seen at the moment is making some more resistant carbon support. There were a few papers recently from groups in the US when they coated the C-fade material with a layer of graphene, which makes it more resistant to corrosion, which basically means that you accept the problem, you just try to fix it by coating something on top of it. The problems I've got with this approach is they're really promising, but on the long term, you may have just prevented the problem for a while, and as you run the cell, eventually you're going to actually degrade the cell anyway. So at the moment, I'm waiting to see what happens, but there's a lot of exciting investigation you can do from where we currently are. So I'd like to acknowledge Chuan, and thanks a lot for coming to the talk. And also, I'd like to acknowledge Xiong, who synthesized some of the very exciting catalysts, and Yan, who does some very good work on low platinum fuel cells, and who has helped us a lot with the characterization. And also the Mutis group, which is the group of Professor Armstrong and Professor Mostegami on multi-scale transport in porous media. And then I've got different types of collaborators. We collaborated with Virginia Tech University in the US to access supercomputing resources. We worked also with UCL, helped us with CTA and with overall analysis, with Zeiss, who basically gave us the super resolution samples. They were just sitting with data in Zeiss and they didn't know what to do to them. So we launched a project. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the ARC for funding and Kohodo Hydrogen Energy, who's funded this research and given us some great support. So this overall concludes the talk. Well, thank you very much for listening. Hope no one fall asleep too much after lunch. And if you've got any question, feel free to go ahead.
For your experiment talk, is there any question from our audience?